Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Faruk Rahmanovich and I am joined today by Brother Kareem.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone.
In this series, we're doing a chapter by chapter exploration of Sayyid Hussein Nasr's book, A Young Muslim's Guide to the West. We'll be focusing on one portion of a chapter in these sessions and delving more deeply into the ideas within the passage, like what implications can you draw or conclusions you can come to, and showing you how to read these kinds of complex texts more closely. In today's session, we'll be looking at Chapter 3, the Sharia, the dreaded Sharia.
Alright, turn to page 50 for the subheading Morality and Rights. We're going to start at the top of the first paragraph there, and we're going to cover the entire paragraph. So, starting from the beginning, let's just do the first few sentences for right now. Closely connected to this aspect of the Sharia is the question of morality. In Islam, morality is not an abstract ideal. To be good, generous, or charitable are of course emphasized, but these virtues are defined in a more concrete and definite sense in the Sharia itself. Alright, let's stop there. So, the first term that we come across here is Sharia. What exactly does Sharia mean?
So this is one of the fun little terms that get all over the place. Quite often people actually mix up Sharia and another sort of Islamic legal term, which is fiqh. And generally speaking, Sharia is quite often translated as Islamic law or Islamic holy law or whatever else. The sort of proper Western translation would be something like canon law, right? And canon law is the sort of core set of rules and regulations and guiding principles according to which everything else runs. So Sharia as canon law is drawn from primary sources. So if the Quran says you have to do this, then Sharia, like that's where Sharia gets that idea from, right? Like straight from the source. So must, can't, do this, you're prohibited from doing that, so on and so forth. That's how it's populated.
Sure. Let's pause for a second here. You said primary sources. Let's quickly explain the difference between a primary source and a secondary source.
Right, so a primary source would be the original text itself.
So in Islam, our primary sources are?
There's the Quran, and then there is, as a sort of lesser primary source, you'd take the hadith, and in that only the sort of the Sahih hadith collections.
All right, and then what would an example be of a secondary source?
Somebody like Imam Ibn Malik's interpretation of how to apply that to something.
So a secondary source then is someone else writing about and interpreting or synthesizing information from the primary sources.
Correct. So for example, the question of using LSD is never addressed in Islamic primary sources, and that's because it was invented in the 1970s, right? So there is no primary source ruling on LSD as such, right? There is no ayah of the Quran that says, you know, do not use LSD. Like that's not a thing in the Quran. That's not a thing in the Hadith. The secondary sources look at the purpose of certain rules and prohibitions in primary sources. Like alcohol is prohibited because it messes with one's intellect, and therefore anything that you voluntarily take and that messes with your intellect ends up being prohibited. So whether it's a different kind of alcohol or whether it's drugs or anything like that, it all sort of gets worked out that way. Now that part that's worked out there, that's called, in English, that term is jurisprudence. In Arabic, the term for that is fiqh, and that is the result of the work of legal scholars dealing with problems of their times. So you can think of this as a distinction that's anchored in the notion of divine revelation as perfect and everlasting, so Sharia cannot change, as opposed to the sort of imperfect contextual application of those ideas to a particular set of circumstances, and that is fiqh. So fiqh changes generation to generation, location to location, depending on what the context is. Sharia, or the guiding principles there, don't. Now, maybe as a sort of a decent analogy, not a perfect one, is something like this. The Constitution of the United States gives us the framework by which the government and the laws are supposed to be constrained, right? And each state in the Union is free to develop their own laws in order to best deal with their own particular situations and serve their residents. However, all state laws are ultimately subject to federal laws, and these are drawn from the Constitution, and must remain within the boundaries created by the constitutional framework, or else those laws are wrong and they get overturned. So in the same way, the Sharia law, the canon law, functions as the Constitution by providing this general framework, and this enables legal scholars and courts to establish through jurisprudence or fiqh any laws that they deem useful or necessary for their particular circumstances, so long as they remain within the boundaries of the legal framework posited by Sharia law.
And we have a body in this country, and many other countries do as well, whose job it is to interpret the primary texts, the Constitution. We call it the Supreme Court.
Yes.
And the Supreme Court, like fiqh, can change. Like their rulings can change with the passage of time. So, for example, in Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court said, yes, it is fine to segregate people based on race, the concept of separate but equal. Roughly 60 years later, they looked at the context. They looked at what was happening in the country, what had developed as a result of that ruling, and they said, no, separate is inherently unequal. It is actually not acceptable.
Now, notice, for example, in both of those decisions, that the principle that they're trying to follow is this idea of rights that are there, right? And that's part of what the Constitution is supposed to be protecting. And so they thought that you could maintain those rights equally while being separated. And that's that original claim. But then as time goes on, I mean, that's why they couldn't just stop with separate and like period, right? Had to be but equal. That was the justifying part for the separation, right? And then 60 years later, they look at it and they go like, well, that equal part never really materialized, did it? And therefore, that first clause, the separation, is no longer justifiable because it's not meeting the goal, which is the equality goal up top. So that's the overriding concern was the equality. Now, I'm not saying that this is true for the thinking of every Supreme Court justice at the time, right? But at least that's the way that they had to phrase it, because that's what the Constitution demanded. So that's the idea there.
Okay. So let's take a look at the next sentence. In Islam, morality is not an abstract ideal. What do they mean here by abstract ideal?
So in ethics, as in real life, we have this way of just sort of talking about doing the right thing, doing the good. Why can't you just be a good person, sort of thing. But in that case, this idea of goodness is this undefined, floating in ether kind of a concept. So what it means to be good, if left up to people, seems to be changing on like a daily basis. There's a great line out of the very end of the movie called Talented Mr. Ripley with Matt Damon. He does terrible things, right, from our perspective as the audience, but as the movie ends and like he commits yet another murder, there's this like voiceover of him talking, and he goes like, at the end of the day, nobody thinks of themselves as a bad person, right? So no matter what you do, we always sort of justify it to ourselves. We don't then think of morality as something that is external to us, something that is objective, and something that judges us based on its rules, over which our emotions have no sort of place to interrupt and to sort of justify, like, well, what had happened was, it's like, it doesn't matter what had happened. Did you do the right thing or not? At least that's the modern setup. Traditionally, every society had exactly that setup, the idea of objective external rules that we all had to abide by. So Islam then doesn't have this. Islam actually posits the idea of objective external set of rules that apply to every person alike in their core formulation.
All right. And I believe that relates well to the next sentence. To be good, generous, or charitable are of course emphasized, but these virtues are defined in a more concrete and definite sense in the Sharia itself. So first off, the word concrete and the word abstract are generally used as opposites of each other. Here, concrete referring more to that which is definite. Although literally definite is the next word here. But yeah,
solid, perhaps. If you think of the idea of abstract as nebulous, as wispy, ephemeral, concrete is the opposite of that, right? It's if an ephemeral thing falls on your foot, like like little dandelion seeds that go flying about. If it falls on your foot, nothing. If a block of concrete falls on your foot, something, right? So it's hard hitting and definitely solid kind of a thing, and therefore it is definite as in well defined.
Okay. Back to the beginning of the sentence. To be good, generous, or charitable are of course emphasized, but these virtues are defined. So we have certain concepts here. To be good, like, oh, you're a good person, or you're being generous. And it seems that if you let people choose themselves how to define these terms, like in your example of the talented Mr. Ripley, it becomes really relative, and it becomes self-serving as well. People will consider themselves good pretty much regardless of what they do. There's a saying that I heard one time, everyone is the hero of their own story, right? But from an Islamic standpoint, to be generous or to be charitable or even to be good actually has clearly defined conditions. There's rules. So if I read a news story about some billionaire who has just donated, I don't know, $100,000 to a homeless shelter somewhere, and he holds one of those ceremonies with the giant fake check, right? Where there's, news crews have been invited and, everyone is photographing it and he's shaking hands and that kind of thing. He thinks he's being generous. In fact, many people may think, well, it's a very generous thing to do. You just gave $100,000 to a homeless shelter. However, from an Islamic standpoint, does that really count as generous? Well, we have a critical concept in Islamic morality, which is the idea of intention. Like, why did you do something? So, if you did that because you wanted to help the homeless, and someone else just decided, hey, we're going to hold this whole ceremony kind of thing, that could be one thing. But on the other hand, if you did that so that you would be seen, right, so that people would see that, oh, this guy just did all of this, we're going to think more highly of him now, and that was your entire goal behind doing it, is it really generous anymore?
Well, Islamically, no, right? That's the we'll probably get into this in one of the later chapters, but the one of the first hadith in any Sahih collection is the actions are judged according to their intentions. So, in other words, you get out of an action that which you try to put into it. So the guy that wanted to be seen, who wanted publicity, did he get publicity? Yes. So
Yes.
is there any other reward for you? No, you got exactly what you paid for, right? If you go to a store and you buy a TV, they don't throw in stuff at random because you bought a TV. You got literally what you paid for, what you worked for. So if you work for fame, then there you go, fame. But if you work for doing the right thing in order to fulfill your obligation, in order to fulfill your telos as a human being, then that's the part that counts. And therefore, the idea is that eschatologically, you get rewarded for the things you did when they had the correct intention, not because you did the thing, but because you intended the right thing and put forth whatever effort you could to accomplish it.
Great. So when the second half of the sentence then says, these virtues are defined in a more concrete and definite sense in the Sharia itself, we can look at the issue of intention as being one of the ways that the Sharia defines these virtues, in that it is not a virtue if you did not do it with a good intention. That becomes a prerequisite in order for the action to be virtuous.
Yeah, that's one of the many prerequisites.
Sure. A prerequisite, not the prerequisite, would be the distinction there. Let's move on. All principles of ethical action and all aspects of morality are contained in principle in the Quran, but they are made concrete through the teachings of the Sharia. So what this is telling us is that whether it's good, generous, charitable, or other principles like justice, we can find these principles in the Quran. And through the Sharia, we can get a better understanding of how to actually apply them.
Yeah, so maybe a good way of understanding this, because remember, Sharia has to come from primary sources. There's no secondary source in Sharia. So all that Sharia then actually is the contextual gathering up of these principles from the primary sources and just sort of like putting them into categories. So like, here are things that relate to how you deal with your family from the primary sources. Here are the rules of how you deal with your neighbors, how you deal with the state, how state deals with other stuff, how, like, that's it, right? It's just a collection of rules from primary sources. Now, that means that every single Sharia point is there in the primary sources. And you could sit down and go through the Quran yourself and go through the Bukhari and Muslim Sahih collections and so on and so forth and gather this up sort of for yourself, except that it's a massive body of work. And unless you're really, really good with your language, sure, and knowing the context, you're going to have a very rough time of it. So when we talk about Sharia, we're just talking about, or like a textbook of Sharia, it would just be essentially a bunch of experts that went through and already just went like, okay, here's a pile of these things in some sort of a logical set of grouping, so that you're not reading one thing here and then the next thing you run into is unrelated to the first point because it's talking about a completely different concept.
Sure. Which is why it's such a bad idea, actually, to go through the Quran or through the Hadith yourself, find an ayah or a Hadith, interpret it for yourself, and then say, this must be exactly what Islam has to say about this subject, because there are underlying assumptions here. They're prerequisites that you are knowledgeable enough about Arabic that you know, and not just any Arabic, but specifically the classical Arabic used at that time, and that's in the Quran, and you're knowledgeable enough to understand all of the possible meanings of what those words could mean there. You are knowledgeable enough about other verses or other hadith that could modify it, right? And if you're not, then you're actually lacking context.
Yeah, actually, by default, if you're looking at anything that's sort of been atomized out by itself, then yeah, you are definitively lacking context. I mean, how do you know if the exact line that you picked up, the line can be entirely clear, but you don't know whether you're looking at the rule or the exception.
Right. A classic example of this is actually used by enemies of Islam, who you can find these on websites everywhere, who say things like, well, I found this one particular ayah, the one that translates to kill them wherever you find them, right? Like, well, there you go. I've just proven that Islam is a violent religion. And it's like, well, did you read the ayah right before it or right after it? Or how about all the other ayats about that subject? Or
how about just
hadith?
define the pronoun?
Yeah.
Right? Like, isn't that, like that's like ACT 101. What is the pronoun pointing to? You can't just make a sentence that starts off with kill them. Like, who's the them? You can't like decide what you feel is the them and just plug it in, right? It's silly, because it entirely changes everything about that. So that little bit of context missing, like who's the pronoun about, means that like you literally can't say anything about that line. And then again, is this was that line an exception to the rule, or the rule itself, or something, right? And again, if you don't know, you're just sort of out in the cold.
Sure. And it would be one thing if it was just non-Muslims who did this kind of thing. The real problem, though, is when Muslims do this kind of thing as well.
So I think anytime you find that the biggest Islamophobes on the planet are in agreement with your group about how Islam works, you probably got something wrong. Yeah, so if Alex Jones is in agreement with your interpretation of Quran, you probably have a bad interpretation of the Quran.
Alright, let's move on to the next sentence. One learns through the Sharia how a general moral principle such as justice is to be applied in concrete human actions. I believe we've largely covered this already with what else we've said. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so this is the sort of question. Occasionally people go like, well, how can we have hadith in the Sharia, like, because you have different levels of the quality of hadith, let's put it that way. And you can have them because it's one thing to have an abstract rule. It's a different thing to sort of see it embodied in practice. And this is sort of the whole point of the literature, right? The Prophet gets described as the walking Quran, right? So he's the embodiment of the principles. So if you ever look at a thing and you're like, okay, but I wonder, like, how do you, let's say, balance between these two things? Well, one of the classic things is if somebody has wronged you, you have a right to ask for sort of retribution in some way from the state. You can't go out and get it yourself, but so the state is a thing that you are allowed to. You have the right to petition the state to address this grievance. But then that same ayah will continue and say, but it is better to forgive. And you go like, okay, well, how forgiving should I be? Should I overlook everything? Should I overlook some things? And then you can literally just take a look at, like, well, how was this interpreted by somebody who definitely had grievances, had the power of the state, was sort of the embodiment of the state as well, and then you can see exactly how that plays out. Or the idea of, like, take care of your kids, right? Well, what exactly does that mean? And then you have an example that you can sort of refer to. And maybe this sort of helps seal the point a little bit. Less than 2% of the Quran is direct rules and regulations, right? The rest of it is stories and sort of thought experiments, if you will, right? When it goes like, it is as if, right? And then like what follows is literally a thought experiment that you're supposed to participate in. the point of the stories and the thought experiments is to give you a practical way of understanding those rules, because people are very bad at abstract thinking, or a lot of people are, right? So it's one thing to tell you something like you have a rule against whatever, adultery, I think is actually a really good example here. But plenty of people do it, and they go like, well, you don't understand my situation. And at that point, you point to the story of Yusuf, and you go like, can your situation even hypothetically be worse than his? You have somebody who has been literally called to the act of adultery, and told that if he does not do it, then he is going to be accused of attempted rape. Now, we read that story, we're like, well, but he's going to get out. It's like, yeah, but he doesn't know that. The two possible punishments for attempted rape, one is like immediate death, and the other one is life in prison. And that's not even like modern prisons. That's like Egypt at 1300 BC prison for life. And in that situation, Yusuf is still like, nah, that's okay. Now, if you pay attention to that story, that chunk of that story is the embodiment of this principle, right? Like when it says, do not commit adultery, it means do not, under any circumstances, no matter what, and you will never have worse circumstances than the case study that you're looking at right now, right? Compared to that, what's your, but I love her, man. Like, it doesn't have the same oomph as you're going to go to jail forever if you don't. And still the right thing is do not, because that's the rule.
Something else I noticed with this sentence, that it says, one learns through the Sharia how a general moral principle such as justice is to be applied in concrete human actions. I don't know if Sayyid Hussein Nasr was aware of modern circumstances and writing specifically for them when he says this, but it did strike me, his use of the term justice as the principle that he chose here. Because if you look at modern activism, it seems that there are basically three underlying principles that they keep referring to. And justice is one of them, along with rights and oppression. You will pretty much hear those terms used more than anything else by modern day activists. Right? Justice is the goal. It's what they're trying to get to. Oppression is what they are fighting against. And rights are essentially the premises, right? The underlying assumption is that people have certain rights, and oppression is taking people's rights away from them, and justice is restoring people's rights to them. So, at a basic level, that sounds really good, right? I don't think anyone has a problem with that as a concept. The issue here, though, is how you define these terms. And you have to make sure you're defining them correctly. Because if what you define as rights is actually a rather incoherent set of concepts, then your understanding of the other two, justice and oppression, are also going to end up being incoherent.
Yeah, if since it's off of your rights that you figure out that you're being oppressed, right? That something has been taken away from you, and that's why you're going to attempt to pursue justice to restore that. Yeah, you're right. It's get that wrong, get everything wrong.
So how do we get them correct then?
Well,
how do we get them right? Well, we can only get them right if we define the terms correctly, and from an Islamic perspective, the definitions for the terms should exist within the Sharia, because they are general principles, and the principles of our faith should exist within the Sharia.
Correct.
Let's move on. Next sentence. In Islam, man does not himself decide what is just or generous, but relies upon God's injunctions, while there is also an important role for the conscience which Allah has placed within the being of each person. First half of that, I believe we just covered with our discussion there. The idea that it is God's injunctions that determine these principles like justice, generosity, rights, oppression. But Nasr adds something else in here too. He says, while there is also an important role for the conscience which Allah has placed within the being of each person. So what do you think he means by that?
One of the ways to misunderstand the concept of Sharia, of in fact any set of rules that you're pitching as external and objective, is as being entirely determining of every single act that you do. In other words, you have to turn into a robot of some variety, right? You have to give up something like free will. You have to just do these things that are prescribed and nothing else. And that's sort of exactly the wrong way to envision these rules. And that's the case in literally every traditional society and every classic religion. Like, that's not the case. Instead, the way to think about this is that first part, the relying upon God's injunctions to figure out what are these definitions. You can think of that as a framework, right? Imagine a blank canvas in a frame, right? Now, I give you whichever medium you would like to paint with, and you can paint whatever you would like on that canvas. But the rule is, you have to stay on the canvas and you cannot paint the frame. That's it. So that's the role of conscience, right? It's the way that you're going to apply this into the world. So the rule is, for example, you have to give, sake of argument, for charitable giving, the absolute minimum you have to give is whatever is prescribed by zakat, right? You're welcome to be more generous than that, but that frame is keeping you from being less, not even generous, less righteous with your money.
Sure.
And there's also that frame also constricts you in terms of, can I give away so much that I harm my family? Because they also have rights, right? So that there is some sort of a framework, and inside of that you're welcome to go as nuts as you want, so long as you are within this framework. Your individual conscience can guide you to do more, or to engage in a variety of different ways, whatever fits your context and your circumstances. So long as you are on that canvas, it's all good, right? So it's not this like hyper restrictive thing. It just gives you a couple of hard limits that cannot be crossed.
Okay, let's move on to the next sentence. The norms are determined by the Sharia for certain basic actions, while in each type of human activity, room is left for man to apply the Islamic ethical teachings according to the dictates of his conscience. This is his way of explaining what you just said there. The analogy that I would use, as opposed to like a painting, I would think in terms of like a house. Right? The foundation and the walls can be thought of as like the framework there, but what you do inside the house, how you choose to decorate it, what room you decide the bedroom is going to be or where it's going to be located, these become things that are up to you. Next sentence. There is therefore nothing mechanical or blindfolded in Islamic ethics as some have claimed. So the idea of mechanical, this is, you said robot before, it's the same idea here. If everything were already decided for us, and the Quran, or the Hadith as well, basically just consisted of a list of rules, and those rules somehow managed to cover, in specifics, every single thing that could ever apply to a human being within the entire realm of human experience. then Islamic morality would become strictly mechanical. It would just be a matter of, I'm going to go to the book, I'm going to look it up. All right, how fast am I allowed to drive my car? Well, it says that I'm allowed to drive my car only up to this speed. Okay, shut the book, put it away. I'm only going to drive up to this speed.
Notice, by the way, that you can't, that wouldn't even work under those circumstances. Because what do you do for cases that require reaction too fast for you to go and check the index and look up the rule?
There would have to be a whole list of exceptions underneath each rule that account for all the contingencies, right? Like I said, it would have to account for every possible thing that could happen within the realm of human experience. Then you would have an obligation to memorize all of them and perhaps even practice them to the point where it would almost just become a reaction, which comes across as rather impractical.
Yeah, because you have an infinite number of possibilities, right? And you only have a finite book by definition, no matter what you have. The set of rules that you're going to have are going to be finite. Now, what you can try to do is, in essence, what like the Amish have tried to do, or what the Taliban tries to do, and that is lock in a society at a certain level and then prohibit everything new, because anything new that would come in would now upset your existing set of behaviors, right? If you're allowed to use a telephone, then, and that was the rule, right? It says you're allowed to use a telephone. Then somebody brings in a smartphone. Can you now use the telephone to play Angry Birds? See, it's not specified. So you can't allow a smartphone to come in, or a tablet, or anything that is beyond that very specific level of development. So you have to lock in the context, which then also means that you can't make this thing universal. It has to be like regionally specific.
Yeah. To be more specific about that point, the rules would be limited strictly to Arabs, or even specifically the Arabs of that particular place and the culture that they had. Because if they were to try to go to Egypt or somewhere in West Africa, as the Muslims did, well, they don't do everything the same way. They don't even live in the same kind of environment anymore. And so, therefore, a whole new set of rules would have to exist for them, which the Arabs had, but would have no context for understanding. They would essentially have to be carrying around a whole ton of rules that apply to every other context and every other society without any ability to understand what those things are, right? Like, I don't know, the word airplane. Right?
Yes.
Presumably the word airplane did not exist in Arabic, but they would have to carry this word around with them in preparation for the time at which airplanes had been invented, and then all of the various rules regarding airplanes would now be applicable.
Well, right, but the problem is, like, you're assuming, like, those rules, you just carry them around and do nothing, but you would actually have to contradict yourself. Because sooner or later you're going to have a rule that reads as if it applies to your thing, even though it doesn't. And you would have no way of knowing what it applies to, and now you'd end up with two contradictory rules. So, like, for example, you would have to have a rule that would specify, while you're in the process of memorizing things, what do you do when you don't know a rule and you don't have enough time to react? There would have to be a rule to cover that, because otherwise you'd just do a random action? So you'd have to do something, and it's like, as soon as you have that, then you actually have to have a principle of how you think for yourself. So there's Arthur Koestler in his Ghost in the Machine book, when talking about how parts and wholes work together, there's this idea that any functional system, and by functional he just means that it's not going to collapse in on itself and tear itself to pieces. It has to be composed of fixed rules, so that the kinds of rules that are not subject to any change no matter what, but that those rules have to be applied by the different entities within the system in it has to be applied as flexible strategies. In other words, I know what the point is, I know what I'm trying to do, and then how I get that done depends on where and when I am and what are my circumstances. So, for example, apparently it's a thing in Southeast Asia that one of the ways that one shows affection for their spouse is by getting them chocolate. But the kind of chocolate they get has, chili peppers in it because that's part of their culture, right? Now that is, as in abstract, that is showing appreciation to your significant other. But if my wife got me chocolate with chili peppers in it, I would die, right? So that would be the opposite of showing appreciation. That would be a murder attempt. So the principle is the same, right? Show affection in whichever way is actually appropriate in your context to your significant other, right? How do you show respect to parents? Well, I'm Bosnian, so part of showing respect to my parents is that I never call them by their first name. And then when we came to America, and my friend goes like, well, Stacy said, I was like, who is Stacy? And they're like, oh, that's my mom. I'm like, oh. But it seems super rude from my perspective to do that, but it's not within this context. So there is this very, very contextual understanding, and that means that you, as somebody who's acting in the world, is actually required to think and to understand your context and to understand the rules, those immutable rules, so that you may properly embody them as you act in the world. So you are very far from a robot. You are a unique embodiment of those rules within a unique context that is your life as you play that out.
Great. So to sum this up, the concept of having a mechanical Islamic morality is inherently incoherent.
Yes.
Yes. Now, how about blindfolded? What do you think he means by a blindfolded Islamic ethic? So one possibility that comes to my mind when I see the word blindfolded is I think of someone being blindfolded. And I think, okay, well, they cannot see. Well, perhaps it has to do with not being able to see the consequences of one's actions.
Maybe you could look at it that way, but it's more like if you're going to go walking about, which is what living is, and I blindfold you, and then you willingly walk around with this blindfold on, right? You are subjecting yourself to this incoherent way of being, right?
Well, you are lacking any context now.
You are lacking context, you're lacking reason, you can't think or understand what is happening or what will happen. There is the inability to see forward, sort of version of that. And you just have to be stumbling about, and that's sort of the idea, right? If I don't look up from my book, I just stare at it and I do, it says, well, it says go 3 steps forward and turn left, go 5 steps, and like it doesn't matter that I just walked off a cliff, kind of a thing, right? If I'm not looking up at the world, if I'm not actually engaging in it, in the context of the world, then I'm acting blindly. Now, the word in question here is one of my favorite Arabic words. It's taqleed. The etymology of it is contains the basic notion of putting a rope on an animal's neck. So once you have sort of roped the animal, where you go, it follows, because it doesn't really have much of a choice. So he continues for the meaning. To put on a necklace, as a result, to copy, imitate, ape, to follow someone blindly and accept a thing without hesitation or question. It's a critical problem, because that's the attitude that is actually used to describe the people who get destroyed after the prophets come to them. Right, so a prophet comes and goes like, hey, you guys are doing terrible things, and they go like, well, we're just following our forefathers. And it's like, that's cool, but what you are doing is terrible, but this is what our ancestors did. It's like, okay, but can we at least talk about it and see, like, maybe you have good intentions, but it's just not translating very well into reality? And then, the people go like, shut up or we'll kill you. What they are doing there is called taqleed, right? They're blindly following, simply imitating their ancestors. It is as if the ghost of their ancestor has tied a rope around their neck and is just sort of dragging them along, and they're passively going with, right? There is no actual critical engagement with anything, and that's that's part of that idea of blindly following. There is no version of blind following that is anything other than an atrocity.
All right, let's move on to the final sentence, which is a rather long one, so we'll divide it up into a few parts here. Islam does provide concrete directives for man to follow, but also leaves a vast area of human life open for man to apply Islamic moral principles as a servant of Allah, bestowed with conscience, aql, and the sense of discernment. So first we have the idea that there are concrete directives for man to follow. We've discussed that idea a little bit before. Also, though, that there is a vast area of human life open for man to apply Islamic moral principles. This is the part where it's not mechanical anymore. Yes. Now, the final part says that as servants of Allah, we are bestowed with three things: conscience, aql, reason, and the sense of discernment. Let's take a quick look at each of those three here. So we've discussed conscience a little bit already because he mentions the term earlier in the paragraph. I believe in at least one of our previous videos we've discussed the concept of reason, aql, quite a bit. A sense of discernment. So an ability to tell the difference between right and wrong.
I'd actually expand that a little, not just the difference between right and wrong, but the ability to be able to meaningfully identify in which ways things are the same and which ways they're different, and to, for a particular purpose, be able to tell whether the similarities or the differences are the part that matters. So that it's that idea that you have there, it's just taken a couple of levels like further down. So it's discernment across the full spectrum.
Sure. So for example, one form of reasoning is analogical reasoning.
Yes.
And there can be some really strong benefits to using analogical reasoning, but there's also some pitfalls to it. Right. And one of the big pitfalls is if the things that you are trying to compare by analogy are just too different from one another, especially if those differences exist within some essential part of the comparison being made.
Yeah, and for example, that's one of the threats with using analogies. It's that if you haven't grasped the sort of issue well enough, you won't recognize that there is this disparity where you need similarity, right? It will be a thing where you will not imagine that a discrepancy is in any way relevant, right? And we've all sort of done this where we think a piece of information isn't relevant, so who cares what it is? Then it turns out it's relevant, or we thought that it was relevant, and then it turns out that it isn't, and so that ends up changing our position long term. So yes, it's a way of thinking, but it's not the only way. And so then being able to discern sort of goes all the way down in the similarities and the differences and the kinds of comparisons, in locating ourselves ultimately within the larger context and our purpose within the larger purpose and all the rest of that. So there is one point that I'd actually like to get to on top of this, which is the way that we think of what religion is and what it does and what it doesn't do. And I think, one, it works pretty well with the idea of these fixed rules and flexible strategies thing that we've had going on. but on the other hand, it gives you sort of an abstract way of understanding what the whole shebang is about. So I think we can, reasonably speaking, imagine religion as sort of a five-step way of thinking about everything. So one, by the very act of existing, you, I, and everything else is forced to play a game. And point two, this game has some sort of rules. Point three, these rules will tell you how to win and how to lose. Point four, your preferences, opinions, desires, and everything else have no impact on the rules or on the performance analysis of you that will sort of be part of winning and losing. And point five, at the end of your life, you are judged by these rules, and your performance is evaluated to be a winning or losing performance on the basis of how you fit inside of the rules. Let's start off with the idea of having rules. Every game that we know of, every sport, has a set of rules that make it that game rather than any other game. Most games have some sort of a ball in common. There might be some sort of an object with which you hit a ball, and despite that being the case, baseball and golf are rather different games with a skill set that does not readily transfer from one to the other. Right. Those rules are going to tell you what it takes to be, what it's going to take to win or to lose, at least in a hypothetical sense. Right? Like, I know what it takes to beat Tiger Woods. I just need to have a better, a lower score than him. Now, I happen to know these rules. It's not going to help me very much playing against Tiger Woods. Right? So just the abstract knowledge is one thing. My preferences, opinions, and desires have no impact on the rules. Meaning, like, why can I only throw the ball forward once when playing football, and then all the other subsequent passes have to be back? Who knows?
Why can only the goalie use his hands in soccer?
Well, I mean, I can give you an answer to that, but it's sort of arbitrary one way or the other, because if everybody could use their hands, then it would be
Rugby.
rugby or handball, or like something, right? It wouldn't be soccer anymore. So the fact that I don't like a rule or I don't agree with it says absolutely nothing as to what the rules actually are. So it says nothing about whether or not I'm going to win the game. My agreement or disagreement with the rules is irrelevant. Only my behavior in accordance with the rules is the relevant part. And finally, at the end of a match, we take a look at how, if it's a one-person sport, we take a look at how you behaved in regards to the rules. If it's a multi-person or multi-team sport, we can take a look at how both the sides behaved in regards to the rules, and that gives us who won and who lost. Now, I really like the sports analogy because the rules do not actually restrict you from being crazy creative inside of the game, right? So you are playing soccer, whether you're playing the Spanish tiki-taka passing style, or the Italian catenaccia, or the German high pressing, or British counterattack. Like, these are entirely different styles of play, and yet they're all playing soccer. So all of this creativity inside of the rules is perfectly fine, but the rules are what makes the game soccer, right? So religiously, the rules are what makes this worldview Islam. And if you don't the Islamic position is that if you don't behave in accordance with these rules, the judgment at the end of it is going to be not in your favor, and that's going to suck on a permanent basis.
Sure, that's where we get into the idea of scoring. So just as in a sport or in a lot of board games there is some sort of a score involved, your book of deeds at the end is your score. You don't get to decide what counts as what number of points, whether it's in soccer or on the Day of Judgment. Those rules are already made for you. You have to play within the rules. And I mean, there's no cause for complaint either, right? You can't say, well, I don't think it's fair that, this is worth this much, but this other thing is worth this much instead. In the context of a sport, I suppose you always have the choice of not playing, right? In the terms of life, we don't really have the choice of not playing. However, you could make the argument that Allah actually fundamentally gave us all a choice at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Allah asked all of our souls at the beginning, who is your Lord, right? And he said, and we all said, "You're our Lord." I believe that's actually somewhere in this chapter
Is it?
as well. We may want to
Or is
locate
it the previous?
that.
I think it's actually in the previous chapter. But we can double check later and just add more stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's kind of like we were asked, like, are we okay with playing this game? We all said yes. So all you have to do is play by the rules that you've already agreed to.
Sure. The word that Nasr specifically uses is covenant.
Yes. As in the Ark of.
Wanna call it here?
Just as sort of a closing part of the chapter, he says, ultimately one might say that the most important political teaching of Islam is that Islamic society should be ruled by divine law and by forms which issue from the teachings of the Quran and Hadith. This is bottom of page 62. Now, a Westerner reading this can get all sorts of tripped up, right? You go like, hey, don't we have a thing where we have a separation of church and state? And that's sort of a conversation for later, but what he means here by governance, by divine law, is sort of precisely this framework governance, right? You have to set up your society on the basis of some rules and define your terms in some particular way, right? And it seems a little weird to me personally that people are okay if Bob came up with laws, but not if Steve came up with laws. I mean, if you're Muslim, obviously you believe that this is divinely ordained and all the rest of that, but if you're not, then you think that a person wrote it. So why is, John Locke better than the author of the Quran? Right? In both cases, it's just ideas. So you should be sort of, I guess, evaluating them on their practical merit, if you will. But either way, the idea is you have to define your terms clearly and in a way that actually makes sense, because otherwise your whole everything else will fall apart down the line. And once you have those terms in place, you are as free to act inside of that system as you are, in essence, inside of any system that actually has defined concepts of good and bad. Some things have to be prohibited. No, but I don't see anybody like protesting the fact that, burning, raping, and pillaging is against the Constitution. Nobody's like trying to overturn that. That's because we have a term that we've decided is bad, and that's off the table, but you can do whatever else you'd like inside of that. So in some ways, this idea of divine law isn't the notion that there's going to be some bearded dude with a turban who's going to be telling us what the rules and regulations are. It's a set of laws, and then inside of that we have to use reason in order to apply these things to what's happening, one way or the other.
Let's wrap this up here for today.
All right,
guys.
So thank you guys for listening. If you have questions, comments, whatever else, feel free to leave it in the comments or shoot us an email, and we'll see you all for chapter 4.